My name is Jerm. This is Jerm Warfare, the battle of ideas.
Robert Frederick, thank you for joining me in the trenches, part 2.
Part 2.
Last time you chatted to me, we chatted about quote unquote William Shakespeare.
Yes.
And how Francis Bacon pretty much wrote everything.
Yeah. Yes.
And the response has been very good, but there have been a few people arguing that it wasn't Francis Bacon, there was actually somebody else, and I forget the name now.
Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford. Yeah.
Mm.
He's very popular at the moment. He's very sexy. He's a very bad boy. And he checks all the boxes you would have to check to be Shakespeare. You have to have very good education. You have to be on the inner circle of the court life of the Elizabethan court. You have to be well-traveled. And, you know, somewhat of a writer. And de Vere checks all those boxes. He even checks a box of a possible love affair with Queen Elizabeth. And I don't know, sometime in the 1920s, I think someone wrote a book about de Vere. And his cause has really grown, especially in the last like 20 or 30 years. There's a number of books. There's a Oxford Society that has meetings, and it's nowhere near the level that the furor was about Francis Bacon around 1900 when Mark Twain wrote his book about it. And the Francis Bacon Society, which is still in existence, has been in existence for 150 years. But they really like de Vere because Bacon is just a very unlikable fellow. He was a lawyer and Attorney General and Lord Chancellor of England. And when people think of Shakespeare, they want to think of a pure artist. And they just can't reconcile those two things. It's the way I look at this de Vere obsession. There's another group that likes to think Christopher Marlowe wrote the plays, which to my mind is really silly because nobody saw him. He got killed. He was a spy and he got killed. And no one ever saw him again, but because his plays, the Christopher Marlowe plays, are so similar to the Shakespeare plays, they think Marlowe wrote all the plays in hiding. So that's a real stretch. With de Vere, the problem is this. He died in 1604, excuse me. And the first folio, the all-important first folio that contained all 36 Shakespeare plays at the time was published. It was 1623. So de Vere had been dead for 19 years, and it's shown by wide groups of scholars that a number of plays were written after de Vere died. But for some reason, the Oxfordians insist that he wrote all the plays with the little group of writers he had, because he did write plays and he had a little group of writers with him. Other than that, there's really not a lot tying him to the plays, although they keep coming up with more and more kind of hints and clues that maybe it was de Vere. But compared to the evidence for Bacon, it's really not even close, especially the fact that he was dead for 19 years. And the first folio is, I think I mentioned our last show, is considered the most influential secular book ever written. And it contains an elaborate 11-page introduction that introduces William Shakespeare to the world, because nobody had ever really heard of him unless you were a writer in London or very involved in the theater scene. It's a very elaborate introduction that kind of created the Shakespeare hoax, because it has the great playwright Ben Jonson, who there's no controversy about. He was on the scene for many years. He was clearly a writer. He wrote a very elaborate poem praising Shakespeare. And this very extreme language is kind of like divinely guided and a poet for all ages, equal to the Greeks and the Romans. such and such and such. And because of that, really that intro alone, about 100 years later, people, because England had a civil war very shortly thereafter, and it was kind of chaos. And it was only about 100 years later, people were like, well, who is this William Shakespeare? It says he's from Stratford in this first folio. Let's go to Stratford. And that's when the controversy began, because they could find nothing in Stratford that showed that William Shakespeare was a playwright. He was alive, he was a real person. But kind of immediately it was like, wow, this guy from Stratford couldn't have even been very well educated. He never went to college. They started digging around, and this big hole in the life of William Shakespeare began to be evident, which people filled in, as people do, as I've learned from studying this, like we fill in the missing information. And that got filled in with like, well, he's just a genius. He's just this astonishing genius who could just write poems. But then 100 years later, like around the 1850s, people realized these weren't just ordinary plays. These were very dense with philosophy and history and sailing, and they looked past the stories, and literature departments opened in universities, and people started to do close readings of the plays, and they were like, no way anyone without a graduate degree could have written these plays, or at least someone without access to books and access to the court of Elizabeth and access to rich people and someone who traveled to Italy. All these big necessary items to the biography of the writer of the plays became very apparent. But it took a long time for that to become apparent. And that's when the controversy began. And that's when people began to look for other authors. And so now it's been almost 200 years. People have been gathering evidence to show who they believe the other author is. To get into the weeds real quick, the controversy actually existed during Shakespeare's lifetime and during Bacon's lifetime. People did say something's wrong here, but they were shut up very, very quickly, because this was an operation at the very highest levels of the Elizabethan government. People like William Cecil knew, I'm sure Elizabeth knew. Bacon was himself a spy. He was involved with military intelligence. And that's really what I wanted to talk about today. It's not just that Shakespeare was a hoax and that Bacon did it. My work is, what does that mean that they hoaxed it? And what does it mean that Bacon wrote those plays? Because there's this enormous industry of people interpreting the Shakespeare plays. And it's really fun. I'm sure you like to do it. You see a movie and you talk about, what are the deeper meanings of this movie? What do the characters represent? And then you're going to go to, well, who wrote it? Like, how does it represent the biography of the person who wrote it? And how does it represent the time it was written in? What are the political meanings of it? And the Shakespeare plays are so remarkable because they're open to multiple interpretations. As a lot of great art is, it's not certain exactly what it means, because that's kind of how life is. We're all debating what life really means, and great art reflects life. So to interpret art correctly, you have to know something about who wrote it, especially if it's about historical personages and a certain time period that they were living in. The biography would be very important. So we have to reinterpret the Shakespeare plays as one level. But then if the plays were written by a master of espionage, that adds a whole new element to their interpretation. And then and someone like Francis Bacon, who was fascinated with empire and building an empire. And the most important story of the last 400 years on planet Earth is the birth and establishment of the British Empire. And that began right at the same time as the Shakespeare plays were being written. And I found all kinds of quotes, which are in my essays, and will be in the book that I'm writing, of how important Shakespeare was to the British Empire, and how you sort of can't think of England without thinking of Shakespeare. And I spoke about this the last time, that they've kind of become synonymous, Shakespeare and England. But my theory is that Bacon created this myth of the great genius coming from the English soil to have a poet of the empire, to have a heart. Like Shakespeare really is the heart of England. And I have found numerous quotes from numerous writers who say exactly that. They praise Shakespeare in the most astonishing ways, and especially during the wars, World War I and World War II, I found these things. I don't have it in front of me, but like how important, how the words of Shakespeare come to our ears when we're lying in the trenches. What, how profound he becomes to an Englishman at these trying times. So I found all this evidence that shows this intuition of mine is correct. And the plays themselves are very martial. But I've gone even further than that, in that the way we're so inundated with propaganda today and media, I really think Shakespeare is the model for that, intentionally. And there's some plays that are just pure propaganda that we're now just inundated with constantly.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm jumping in here, but
No, fine.
you're kind of alluding to a case that you've made that Francis Bacon shaped what would become known as scientism.
And then it goes to scientism is a big part of what Bacon wanted. And that it took me a couple of years to make this connection, but now I clearly see how the Shakespeare plays are connected to a scientific worldview and ultimately to scientism. Because there's one more element here, is that Francis Bacon is responsible for creating Freemasonry, modern Freemasonry, from many different elements. And the Freemasons were there at the birth of modern science, which was the Royal Society in London. They got together just before the Civil War, and then they officially got together after the war, and they absolutely acknowledged Francis Bacon as their inspiration. In their first book, just a few years after they were founded, The History of the Royal Society has a very famous, well, to people like me, frontispiece with Francis Bacon right in there with all this Masonic symbolism. And this is 50 years before the Masons became official, which was 1717. So you get these three elements that Bacon created, which was Shakespeare and Freemasonry and modern science. And there's no argument with him as the inventor of modern science. There's nobody else remotely considered as someone who would have started Freemasonry besides Bacon. And there's some very heavy weights out there that point to Bacon too, people like Manly P. Hall. And as for Shakespeare, there's really no one to compete with him besides De Vere for being Shakespeare. So that's really what my work is about, is putting these three things together to show how they've really created our modern world, especially recently with, the COVID pandemic, which was all about scientism and people having faith in what scientists said, and then taking the remedy that science made. And that's where it really came out, with trust the science. I mean, that's a ridiculous thing to say if you actually know what science really is, that science is ongoing. You could say, believe in the scientific method, but there's never a finality to science, in real science. And the idea of trust in God has just been wiped out by trust in science. And that is pretty much in the Shakespeare plays, because The plays, when you really get into them, and they're famous for this, they kind of pull the rug out from under you. There's no certainty. There's almost no religion. There's almost no spirituality. There's trust in government. There's fight for your country. And then there's like a kind of a sick feeling from these plays. They leave you very unsure and uncertain. And even the comedies, which provide some laughs, there's really nothing certain to hold on to. There's just kind of leave you with doubt. So I feel like they're designed to make you want to believe in something like science, which proposes itself as the truth. And maybe there's an element of truth about physical reality, that we know that mice don't generate spontaneously from a pile of rags, which maybe everybody believed in the 1600s, and now we know they're born through conception and mating. But that science can't tell us anything about the most important things in life, like how to love your child and how to make a painting, how to form a government. Like, we can't use science to form our governments. It's really only about physical reality and physical comfort, but because of Bacon, and Bacon implies this in his writing, and it's absolutely in his book. So the book that launched modern science is called New Atlantis. Francis Bacon wrote it. It was published just after he died because it would have been very controversial then, because it really does show science usurping religion, which was just an outrageous thing to think in 1620s. By 1720, you could start to think it, and by 1750, you could even start to say it. But religion had such a hold on people's minds, it had to wait till he was dead to publish it. And if you read New Atlantis, and I encourage everyone to read it, because it's Peter Thiel's favorite book, and it's an inspiration for the tech bros. It's a vision of a technocracy 400 years ago, to the year. I'm surprised there's not more of a stink being made about it. But he envisioned the first society that was run by scientists and was dedicated to science, which, when you think about it, is a very astonishing prophecy to have made.
It sounds like you're also alluding to Gnosticism.
Well, Gnosticism is the core of this whole project, because Gnosticism is a big part of alchemy. And what I've discovered, again, after years of doing this, is that it's really alchemy that imbued with Gnosticism. It was probably the Gnostics that got people involved in alchemy, because Gnostics feel like this world is a prison, and they're looking for an escape. And that's what gnosis means, is knowledge. And if you have that knowledge, you can escape the world. At that time, say 200 AD, or around the time of Christ, when Gnosticism started, that meant if you gained gnosis during your lifetime, you wouldn't be reincarnated here, because they believe in reincarnation. And if you had this knowledge, you would say the secret passwords to the archons that guard the planet, and your soul could slip past the prison guards and be free. This is what they literally believe. And then they started to either desecrate life by doing horrible things, because there's no good and evil. The whole place is evil. And so they could either desecrate life, or they would withdraw from life and try to be pure, not unlike certain Hindu sects, not unlike a Christian monk. And that was their way of escaping the world. But then they started fooling around with combining elements. They started the origin of science, which was to gain knowledge to escape the planet, but also to gain power, yes, and turn lead into gold. Things like that.
And the world around them was, quote unquote, confused matter.
Very good. Exactly. That's Bacon always said. Confused matter. Very impressive, Jerm. And that is the opposite of the truth. The world is exquisitely perfectly created. We're screwed up because we're humans with souls that are trying to figure out our identity and fall in love and raise our kids, and the problems of human consciousness and the human condition create most of the evil in the world. But the world itself, and that's what science has taught me, is like how exquisitely perfect it is, and how nothing goes to waste, and everything gets reused, and everything wants to be alive, and plants are happy, and nothing's happier than a kitten and a puppy, and life is joyful. It's not a prison. But these Gnostics, I know it sounds crazy, but they literally believe that God made the world as a prison and that we're trapped here. And so science, what Bacon did, in my opinion, is turn Gnosticism into Gnostic scientism, and that what these scientists want is control over life and death. And in a certain way, they're at war with God, the Creator. And you'll see this everywhere in modern science, not only for life extension or to conquer death, which they literally said back then, to conquer death, which they're trying to grow babies in the lab. They're trying to create embryos and fetuses in the lab. They're trying to not have to have a woman give birth to children. They're trying to replace organs. They're growing human organs in pigs to put into people. There's this heroic science of turning a man into a woman, which is one reason this whole trans thing took off, is because these crazy surgeons in science, it gives them the sense they're God, that they can turn a man into a woman, and it's kind of taken over. And it came from William Shakespeare. And that's really what my work is about, trying to expose this, this curse almost that's taken over the modern world. And a lot of it is in New Atlantis in terms of science controlling society.
Well, speaking of curse, ignorance is the curse of God, and knowledge is the wing wherewith we fly to heaven.
Have you been reading Robert Frederick?
Maybe.
That's one of Bacon's favorite sayings. That's so Gnostic. Ignorance is not the curse of God. How is that the curse of God? What a crazy thing to say. Ignorance is the curse of laziness or not being curious. I can't believe that saying. And knowledge is the wings where we fly. And then his famous saying, knowledge is power, and power is empire.
But it is kind of true, though. Knowledge is power.
Why can't knowledge be understanding and compassion and peace? Instead, it's power. It doesn't have to be power. It could be the power for understanding and peace. But Bacon, power. I mean, what a freak. What a nut. And it took over. And because of his push for science, science began in London, in England. And then the Industrial Revolution began in London and England. And that's how England got so powerful and how they became an empire, because they had the best science. And it's amazing. If you do go to London, you got to go to the Science Museum. It's remarkable. And immediately, they figured out ways to get more coal out of the ground, and then suddenly they had more energy, and energy is so important. And they had the best ships. They immediately had the best guns because of Baconian science. And then they had, electromagnetism got invented in London. The Industrial Revolution began there. Like everything of any importance, almost, if you think about it, came out of England in the last 400 years, which is just a shocking thing. Just a really remarkable thing. And it started in Elizabethan London, and the number of geniuses there is really off the charts. And as you go through English history, you see this incredible genius there. The Brits are the smartest, and they have the great poetry, great cinema, and espionage. Everybody knows they're the best spies. And I sound like a broken record, but that's Francis Bacon again. He helped start military intelligence in England since he was a little boy. And we talked about this last time. A little boy, I mean a teenager. A teenager. We talked about this last time, like how great they are at espionage, the Brits. And that's partly a result of Shakespeare and acting. And nobody's a better spy than an actor who's acting 24/7. And Bacon was a spy since he was 15 and is so closely associated with the top rung of British intelligence. I say British intelligence, of course it wasn't Britain yet. But it was William Cecil and Francis Walsingham and Amyas Paulet and Thomas Phillips, these guys. Incredible genius. And that's how they solidified Elizabeth and kept her on the throne, because there were multiple attempts to assassinate her. And, they even came through their civil war. They had an early civil war. The Brits overthrew their king before anyone else in Europe. 1640, cut off the head of their king. Now, this is a bunch of BS. And then they restored it. And now they're the only country left with a king that means anything, although he's rapidly, just kind of a clown. But the Freemasons were very pro-monarchy. So that's really what this means, Shakespeare means, as a hoax.
You're painting Bacon as a mad scientist.
Exactly. He's the world's first mad scientist. Exactly. He is a mad scientist, and he gave the disease. He gave the disease. I mean, there's so many mad scientists out there. I even think it's mad to want to go to the moon and to Mars. I think that's ridiculous and impossible. And maybe in one sense, the Gnostics were right. I don't think we can leave the Earth. I think because it is electromagnetic and our bodies are electromagnetic and electrochemical. We are tied to the Earth. In fact, the person who first realized the Earth was magnetic was an Elizabethan colleague of Francis Bacon's, actually, a guy named William Gilbert, a fascinating guy who studied magnetism, and that's probably why electricity really, the math. Brits are also great at math. The mathematical understanding of electromagnetism began in England. It's probably because of this guy, William Gilbert. And here's a huge irony, is that Bacon was not very good at science. He taught people how to do it, and he laid the foundation. But he actually mocked William Gilbert for studying magnetism, which is the single biggest discovery of science, is the creation of electricity, I would say. And that comes from a magnet, and electricity is created by spinning a magnet inside a copper coil. And Bacon completely missed it and mocked this guy William Gilbert for studying magnets. And he didn't discover anything of any importance because he really wasn't a scientist. He was a philosopher and a poet. And he understood alchemy and what was wrong with alchemy. And really, modern science has modified alchemy with the same desire that alchemy had, which was eternal life, the power over life and death. The desire to dominate nature, that's another thing Bacon, that was really new with Bacon, is that a human could dominate nature, not have dominion, but there's a slight difference there. Like, we are the top rung of nature in terms of our ability to think and reason and build. But we can't dominate nature because we're a part of nature. But Bacon really instilled that idea that humans could, he literally said this, conquer the universe. This is a man writing in 1616 wrote that and published that and believed it. And he put that belief in us, and I really think we're in trouble because of that a lot of sickness and nuclear bombs. And
you're creating a very interesting dichotomy between science and dogmatic belief.
Yeah. Exactly. I think what happened is partly because of Shakespeare, science, and the Enlightenment, people began to doubt the existence of God, which is very, very unusual. And most atheists I know have a tremendous belief in science. They just absolutely believe in the Big Bang, which is kind of, yeah, it's kind of silly, the Big Bang, but they believe it.
Atheists will point to, let's say, Christians as being idiotic for believing in a fairy sky god or whatever. Atheists have a placeholder belief, but it's the science.
Exactly. And, or, useful. Of course, religion's useful. Science is useful. I love science. I've always loved it. I still try to keep up with it. The breakthroughs in science or ideas about science, but they've taken it as absolute faith, the same as any religious faith. And when science doesn't know where a single thought comes from, science thinks the brain is a chemical soup of very sophisticated, complicated neurons, which they can, point to the chemicals in those neurons and point to the synapses and the acetylcholine and on and on and on and on and on. But where's the thought? Where's the thought in that? How does a chemical soup become thought? They don't know. They don't know how memory is
Robert,
stored.
When you say, I love science, I mean, that in itself is a weird kind of packaging, because science just really means understanding the natural world. It's really what it actually is.
Yeah, and it gives us comfort. It gives us... my favorite example is you go to the dentist and you get your teeth worked on and there's no pain involved at all. Like science found Novocaine, high-speed drills, and it really is a major improvement in life. Or air conditioning, makes life so much more comfortable. But that's really all that science is good for, which is a wonderful thing. Without science, you and I wouldn't be talking now. I've made loads of friends because of science. It's a wonderful thing, but it needs to stay in its lane.
And as you say, scientists can't explain where new ideas come from.
Yeah. I mean, their faith in the scientific method is just as great as anybody's faith in Jesus or life after death or the Messiah coming or any kind of religious faith. It's the exact as these people's faith in science. And they won't be able to understand that when you tell them that. They'll think you're crazy for saying that. They don't really understand what faith is. They haven't put much thought into it. And what it's doing is giving science too large a role to play in society, particularly around health. And it's they're using science to bludgeon us with these, especially here in the States, with these vaccine schedules and they'll take your kid away from you here if you don't follow the science, which is really scary and tyrannical. And they're also using science for tyranny, to keep closer tabs on us, and the possibility that they could do digital currency.
I mean, that's technocracy.
That's the technocracy, which is what scientism leads to, and these gurus of scientism, like was Yuval Noah Harari, talk about the scientists saying the algorithm will know you better than you know yourself, and scientists say, and it's like, well, if a scientist said it, it must be true, and it needs to be spoken about, and we need citizen committees on science. And I think driverless cars are really a mistake. I think a lot of things that science can do are a mistake, and they shouldn't do them. But there's no checks on science today. Like, why are they creating, embryos in a lab and fake wombs? Like, what is that? And they'll tell you, oh, it's for It's for you. It's to help humanity. They'll always tell you it's for your safety or to cure sickness. But it's really about profit, that the whole scientific industry is largely now about control and profit, when it still has it in people's mind that it's a search for the truth. For truth and understanding, it's largely profit and control. And we need to have this conversation about science. I find it hard to write about, but people are writing about it, and the topic of scientism is growing. The understanding that we live under a religion of scientism is growing. So I'm very encouraged by that.
You said earlier that when you think about Britain, you immediately think about Shakespeare. And I must be honest, I also think about King James.
Do you really? Oh, no kidding. I would think the Beatles or soccer.
Well,
or
yes,
football.
of course.
Those
yes, of course, the
things,
Beatles.
too.
I think the Beatles is one of the first ones that come to mind, who allegedly wrote their own music.
They did a poll amongst the Brits not too long ago, and Shakespeare came out ahead of the Beatles as the most important British person.
But I mean, that's probably true. But now that you mention it, if you say Britain, there are a few things that immediately come to mind: King James, Shakespeare, the Beatles, I suppose Harry Potter.
Right.
I'm trying to think what else in terms of
Premier
pop culture.
League. Soccer, the Premier League is huge. If you have a soccer player in the house, you'll find out. It's huge, the Premier League.
But I mean, regardless of who wrote and recorded the Beatles, I still think they were great.
Yeah. And Shakespeare also has greatness in it. Some of the poetry is remarkable, and people are kind of astonished because it's not just stories, but they're told in a very sophisticated way and strict meter. Some of them, this stuff that's called blank verse, 10 beats per line, almost perfectly throughout some of the plays, lots of rhyming. So the technical virtuosity blows a lot of people away about Shakespeare. And, you'll find that the propaganda we're subjected to is very sophisticated and very well done. And they're good at what they do. That's why it works.
Do you think Shakespeare was propped up by the establishment?
Well, 100%. So one of my intuitions when I saw that Bacon was involved with the Freemasons was that it's really Freemasonry that made Shakespeare famous. Because when you're a Freemason, you take a blood oath to support your brother Freemason. Like, you have to do it if you can. You're obligated to do it. And in these plays, they're saturated with Masonic symbolism. So a Mason seeing these plays immediately understands they're Masonic, and they're supposed to help the play. So they could do that in any number of ways. They could perform in it, they could produce it, they could show it in their theater, they could teach about it in school, they could write a review of it. And it turns out that the earliest promoters of Shakespeare are very famous English poets like Alexander Pope, Samuel Johnson, Samuel Boswell, this guy John Dryden. Very early, he's from the 1670s, was talking about Shakespeare. Thomas Carlyle. They're all Freemasons. Actually, I'm not sure about Carlyle, but Johnson, Boswell, Pope were all Freemasons. And the guy who really kicked off what's called bardolatry, or worship of Shakespeare, is a guy named David Garrick, who is an actor and a Freemason. All these guys are Freemasons. And David Garrick tirelessly promoted Shakespeare as an actor. I think he was a director. producer. He put on the plays. He rewrote the plays and put them on. His name is on a famous theater in England. He literally is the origin of what they call bardolatry, which is worship of Shakespeare. It really is kind of a religion, which you wouldn't know about as an average person, but as soon as you delve into Shakespeare, the admiration for him and the regard for him is really like for a deity. And you can find that kind of language throughout. And you'll find almost no criticism of Shakespeare. Even though a lot of the plays are really gross and harsh and ugly, you'll rarely find an academic or a person of high stature in the intellectual world criticize Shakespeare, because it became, this idea was implanted in people that if Shakespeare did it, that means it's good, that means it's correct. You know, go forth and do the same thing. And I really think Shakespeare and Bacon, I mean, kind of put humanity in a bit of a bind, in a mental cage. And the only really highly regarded person who strongly criticized Shakespeare was Leo Tolstoy, who I think we talked about, and an Austrian philosopher named Ludwig Wittgenstein. He's a very sophisticated contemporary, not contemporary, 20th century philosopher who didn't write about it like Tolstoy. Tolstoy wrote a whole long essay about it and just, you know, ripped into Shakespeare, even called him evil. Wittgenstein was like, I don't like him. I don't think he's a very good writer. And people just can't handle it. Like, if you go online, you'll find out all these essays like, why didn't Wittgenstein like Shakespeare? What was going on? What's wrong with him? How could that be? Well, it's because of this, because of that. Because you have to like Shakespeare. It's a sign of your sophistication, a sign of your, intellectual acumen. But there's a lot to dislike about Shakespeare. And what I found, coming at it fresh, having, independently done some reading, is that I think the birth of literary nihilism is in Shakespeare, particularly Macbeth. I think the birth of existentialism is in Shakespeare with Hamlet. Hamlet is clearly Gnostic. Macbeth is clearly Gnostic. There's the push to empire in the history plays where that glorifies England, glorifies, a warlike attitude. Those are kind of a separate group of plays, the history plays. But this kind of dark view of life is very, very prevalent in Shakespeare. And it's actually quite ugly. But you'll rarely hear that said, and it's starting to come out. They kind of quash it. What I found is these books where some of the tragedies are just so gross, and there's this incredible nastiness that is inexplicable. And like just say, for example, in Macbeth, like the weird sisters that give Macbeth the idea that he's going to be king, they're never confronted. Like, they're the real evil in that play. And they somehow mind control Macbeth and make him think he's going to be king. And then his wife is just, really evil, and they kill the king and cause a civil war. And the witches set it off, and they're never confronted. And the play is thought to be about overweening ambition. Macbeth just was too ambitious. Like, don't be too ambitious, kids. But really, it's about the witches who used evil to mind control Macbeth. I don't think there's any other word for it. It's right there in the play. And the witches are never confronted, and nobody ever finds out about them, and except the two people that saw them and knew them and talked to them were both dead at the end of the play, and nobody else ever saw them. So that the real evil was never confronted. So it's a really deeply nihilistic, very dark play, and it might be the most popular of the Shakespeare plays because it's so violent, and it's a ghost story, and witches and demons, and it's short, and it's one of those plays you can understand without having to study what it means, like so many of the plays. Very, very dark, nihilistic play.
Okay, fine. Francis Bacon was William Shakespeare. Cool. Now what?
The implications are staggering, absolutely staggering, that they could pull off such a hoax. They can still keep it going because there's kind of an industry of academics that try to defend it. A couple of famous writers, I forget their names right now. I've got one of the books right here. James Shapiro. You know, they'll hire these guys to write these books. There's the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust that it defends the authenticity of Shakespeare as the writer of the plays, but it's just completely absurd. Like when you really understand the issues, which they're not actually contested. He says contested will, but the fact that there's no record of him going to school, there's no letters, there's no manuscripts. His parents were illiterate. The town of Stratford was maybe 20% literate. None of these books he would have needed were there. You know, he wasn't part of the court. He never traveled. Like, it's just impossible that he was Shakespeare. Literally impossible, unless you think God, zipped everything into his brain. And their one defense is that, well, you don't think a commoner can be a genius. Well, it's not genius, it's knowledge. You can't just know this stuff. You have to have studied it. You can have genius without having studied. That's not a problem. It's just that there's book learning that he had no access to, and there's life experience that he had no access to, that he couldn't have just imagined. There's just too much of it. It's too detailed. It's play after play after play after play. All the plays deal with rich people, almost all of them. And almost all of them make fun of poor people, which he grew up poor. He grew up a poor commoner. The plays are outrageously mocking of the poor. And Shakespeare somehow got this image of being a humanist, and somebody who's for the people. It's outrageous. He's actually very anti-populist. He's very pro-monarchy. He's very pro-power. Over and over and over again. So it's really kind of the opposite of what we spontaneously think of Shakespeare as a wonderful person and a wonderful poet who cared about humanity, who's been a huge net important plus for humanity, is all not true. The plays just elevate power and nihilism and existentialism, which I think, to tie it into science, kind of makes you reach for something more certain, and at least we know that, we know math, and we know that's real, and you sort of want to grab onto something a little more certain, because the plays do not ever emphasize love. There's very, very little love in Shakespeare, which is shocking when you think about it. And it's Gnostic. And it all comes back down, all of this stuff boils back down to Gnosticism. The Freemasons are covertly Gnostic. Science is ultimately Gnostic. Doesn't have to be. I'm not saying scientists are bad or every scientist believes.
But that's what I was alluding to. Yeah, that's what I was alluding to. So,
no, some science is great. Is good and important and necessary now.
But what I mean is, people still enjoy, quote unquote, Shakespeare, just like I enjoy the Beatles, regardless of who wrote it.
Right, and that's fine. That's fine. I just think it needs to be. I just think it needs another angle of interpretation. Like the way people go into the Beatles and they point to that one album cover where they pose with the chopped up babies. I don't know if you know about that.
Which album was that?
It came out for a second in England. I think some publicist, some Gnostic occultist got them to do it, and it was so nasty, it's so horrible that they yanked it. But if you look it up online, you'll see a copy of it. or they'll point to the fact that Aleister Crowley's in that
Well, he's on that Sergeant Pepper's album.
Sergeant Pepper's. Yeah, he's on that. And they'll kind of point to every little thing that shows the Beatles were bad guys, but it's not really in their music. But then they'll find like Maxwell's Silver Hammer about the serial killer and things like that. But you could do that in Shakespeare. It's like,
Yes.
go ahead.
But
Go ahead, sir.
I will say this. I don't know if you're a big Beatles fan, but
Yes, I am.
all right. So go listen to Rubber Soul. And
Right. I
then
promised you I would do that, and I will. I looked up the song list. And I
those
looked
songs
up
are very different to their previous albums.
the previous album. Yeah, I did look up the two albums. Of course, I recognized all the songs.
And they're
I did
great
listen-
songs.
They're great. They're weird. Almost all their songs are great. It's really weird. It's really remarkable. But people say that about the Shakespeare, because Shakespeare's got a lot of crummy plays. I think everybody acknowledges that. Yeah, it's weird. It's weird how good they were. But those Brits, man, they've got something. They really do. They have great painters. They're some of the greatest painters ever. Mathematicians, scientists, sculptors, I'm not so sure about. Geographers, explorers, sailors, spies, filmmakers, athletes. But you don't think of that when you think of them. You think of like good manners and queuing up on schedule for the bus and politeness. But they're really like extraordinarily brilliant people. And
You don't conquer half the world by asking nicely.
So you never think of that with them, like they're brutal. Like,
Well,
you know,
I mean,
things
I'm
that-
a result of that.
Of course, South Africa, right? Yeah. And what are they doing there? And how did they get their people to go along with it? You know, it's a very, very Christian nation. This Peter Ackroyd, he's a famous English writer. He wrote a book called London. I didn't read the whole thing, but I had it with me when I was in London. He says there's more churches in London than there are in Rome. A really, really Christian nation. But somehow they got their boys to go to Burma and India and Australia, South Africa, and muck things up. But of course, because they told them it was the white man's burden. We have to help these poor backward people. And they buy it. And that's what I mean about the narrative power of propaganda is cemented in Shakespeare. And I am convinced they teach Shakespeare in spy school and in propaganda school. And I've done a whole deep dive into Richard III, where Shakespeare lied about the king just before the Tudors took over. So the Tudor line, Henry VII, Henry VIII, and Queen Elizabeth, were the result of usurping the throne from a king, King Richard III, who Shakespeare portrayed as the vilest human being who ever lived in the play called The Tragedy of King Richard III, which is a total lie. But it got understood as truth. It was expert propaganda. I think it's the beginning of modern propaganda. I think it's the beginning of mass manipulation of the masses. Right there. It was one of the first Shakespeare plays ever. It was one of the first ones printed, the first ones performed. And it took over 300 years. It took until the 1940s till someone wrote a book and said, man, these history plays, they're really slanted. They're really pro-Tudor. They're all there to prop up the Tudors, called the Tudor myth. Took 300 years for people to notice because they got so wrapped up in the intensity of the plays. And when you watch the play and know that it's propaganda, it becomes almost absurdist. It's so ham-fisted and obvious. But it's still powerful. And in fact, they just redid it in a television made-for-TV series called The Hollow Crown. And I encourage everyone to watch Richard III in the Hollow Crown, and you won't believe what you see. If you've never seen this play, you won't believe like the intensity of the emotion generated in this play and how vile Richard is. Like, you almost couldn't be a more vile person than Richard. And it turns out it's all fabricated, and that got exposed by a movie called The Lost King, about a woman, Philippa Langley, a conspiracy theorist who got together with her friends, a group called the Richard III Society, who were saying, I don't think Richard was so bad, really. I think he might have been quite a good king. Why does he have such a bad reputation? I think we mentioned this last time. They would talk to people about it, and the first response everybody had was, "Oh, you don't trust Shakespeare? You don't believe Shakespeare, do you?" And it turns out that they found Richard III's bones, ignominiously buried in a parking lot. Maybe they were part of a church somewhere. But the Tudors, the movie as a subplot, exposes Tudor propaganda against Richard III. It's really brilliant. It's sort of the first chipping away on a large scale at how propagandistic the Shakespeare plays are, and that they're art with a purpose, and that's to cement the monarchy, the present monarchy, and give power to the powerful. It's really remarkable. So everyone, if you're interested, it's a really fun movie. It's called The Lost King. It's Coogan, what's his name? Very funny guy. Coogan made it. He plays the husband of Philippa Langley, and it's based on a true story, and they did find the bones, and they changed history because nobody knew where the bones were buried, because the Tudors were so nasty. I mean, that was really the nasty period, and I just have to think about Henry VIII. I mean, what he did is incredible.
There's another name to think about.
My God. That was Elizabeth's father. Yeah, just incredible. It's actually reversal. It's an inversion of the truth, that Richard III was a decent guy, and the Tudors were vicious. And even Elizabeth, an English Latin scholar, recently put out a book called Shakespeare, the Demonstrable Reality, where he tells you the truth about Queen Elizabeth, who's got a much softer image than her father, Henry VIII, who, as everyone knows, cut off 2 of his wives' heads. And Elizabeth, of course, couldn't do that. She supposedly was the Virgin Queen, but she definitely had children and multiple affairs. But she also had many, many people hung, drawn, and quartered, which is one of the cruelest possible methods of execution imaginable. And it was very, very popular in England for treason. It was traumatic. It traumatized the population. And Elizabeth ordered it over 125 times for Catholic priests. And this book is great. N.M. Gwynn, an Englishman, called William Shakespeare, The Demonstrable Reality. I have a whole podcast on it. And I go over all this stuff in my podcasts and essays, if you want, and with references and sources for all of this stuff. Well,
that's a great segue. So how can I follow your work?
Yeah, check out thehiddenlifeisbest.com. My great webmaster, Susan, put everything in one place. And you can read the articles there, or you can go to Patreon or Substack to read them and listen to the podcasts. And most of the stuff is free. Some of the podcasts, for $5 a month, you can listen to all the podcasts. I strongly recommend Romeo and Juliet, the podcast version. Let's just say Romeo and Juliet's not about love and romance. I won't say any more. No spoiler alerts.
All right. Robert Frederick, thank you for joining me in the trenches.
Thank you, Jerm. Thanks for talking. Great.